there was a number of things that I've kind of had pop up in my head that I was like, this is something that I should talk about. This is something that's relevant. And there's so many different things that I do want to talk about, but I think it's important that, first of all, I explain, sort of my story and where I have come from, where I started, and my progression through my recovery to the point I'm at now, as well as just giving more of an understanding of BPD itself, because I did like explain bits and pieces of it in some of the other videos, but in terms of like what BPD is in a clinical sense according to the DSM. So I figure what I'm going to probably do is we're going to start there, and then I'm going to sort of just explain how each of these 9 criterion that have to do with being diagnosed with BPD, essentially how those were manifesting in my life. And so I'm going to use sources for this because I don't want to get information incorrect. Obviously, it's important to me that I'm giving information that is legitimate. And so what I'll do is, if you see me looking down and reading, it's simply because I have something in front of me. And I will be including the sources in the captions, just to make sure that I'm giving credit where credit is due. But to talk about, so I think I mentioned about the history of borderline, sort of this idea of where the term came from, and the fact that it's sort of balancing on this line between psychosis and neurosis. So, being out of touch with reality and having intense emotional distress. And I'll explain a little bit of that as we kind of go through these. But for the DSM, which is the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there are 9 different criteria that I believe it's 5. I think you have to meet 5 of them in order to be diagnosed as borderline. And so I'm just going to explain what the 5 are. And it definitely speaks to the types of symptoms that you tend to see in people with borderline. But one thing to remember is that if you have 9 of these criteria, it can manifest and look different for different people. So my manifestation of borderline personality disorder, now, but even more so when I was, pre-treatment, that could look very, very different from someone who was also diagnosed, because there's a lot of room for variability in terms of what the symptoms are or the boxes that you yourself check in terms of the kinds of symptoms that you have. So the first one I just want to talk about, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. So abandonment is something that I have mentioned before, and it's something that we will end up touching on again and again, because it is a very strong and clear theme that is kind of underlying a lot of the type of social cognition even that we experience, and how we view the world and ourselves. There's definitely this fear of abandonment that it's kind of always there in the background, and that very heavily influences behavior and the way in which you interact with people. And unfortunately, it does also influence things like, for example, the self-fulfilling prophecy, where, you're afraid of abandonment, and so you start clinging on to people more, and as a result, they kind of end up withdrawing because your behavior is aversive, and so then that sort of just feeds itself in terms of you are clinging harder, they're pulling away more, and then it turns out that you've actually ended up pushing them away, and they abandon you when your ultimate fear was of that happening in the first place. So that's number 1. Abandonment issues, super, super huge when it comes to BPD. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. So interpersonal relationships are probably the most difficult aspect of BPD, and it's also why there is such a stigma, right? Because when there's such turmoil that is experienced when you're interacting with someone with BPD, a lot of that kind of dysregulation that that individual is experiencing, it gets projected outwards onto other people. You know, very characteristic to have, you know, really high highs and really low lows. And this concept of like stability and consistency is kind of foreign for classic BPD type relationships. And it says here, characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. So this is something that I've heard it called splitting before, BPD splitting. Basically, it's this idea of looking at things as all good or all bad. It's this black and white thinking. So you could be, for example, you could think really highly of someone, and then something happens that all of a sudden now that has changed your perception, and all of the good stuff that you really like wholeheartedly believed, all of a sudden that doesn't seem to matter anymore, and all you see is all these negative things about this person. So it's this ability to kind of switch between the two of black and white and this ideal versus horrible kind of thing. Markedly and persistent unstable self-image or sense of self. That's a pretty strong one as well. For me, I didn't really know who I was. And it's taken me a long time through my treatment to figure that out. And that's been a huge part of my recovery in terms of being able to figure out who I am and what it is that I want to do and what my ethics are and what do I believe. And that actually, we can relate that back to regular psychology in terms of the stages of psychosocial development with Erik Erikson, and sort of this idea of identity versus role confusion, and how that kind of sets the stage for whether or not you'll be able to function appropriately in things like relationships and whatnot later in life. But we won't get too much into that. Impulsivity in at least two areas that are potentially self-damaging. So for example, spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. But this does not include suicidal or self-mutilating behaviors. So this is just other stuff outside of the self-harm. So oftentimes, because of the fact that people with BPD have such intense emotions, they are very much, the way in which that they try and cope with this oftentimes results in things like impulsive behaviors. You know, you're feeling lonely, you don't necessarily have the ability to recognize that what you're feeling is loneliness. And so you're looking for something to sort of heal that ugly feeling. And so, you know, maybe it turns into promiscuity, because that's the only way that you're going to gain any sort of validation or a sense of attachment, you know, it's any of those types of things that, you know, can very much be paired with abandonment issues. You know, let's say your father abandoned you as a child, you don't have a good relationship with your father, you may end up seeking out intimacy in forms of sexual acts with other people in order to try and mimic that feeling of having some sort of secure attachment from when you were a kid that you didn't ever really get because of the relationship with your father. Recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. So this is, you know, heavy system use. So for me, you know, I was hospitalized multiple times before I began treatment. I think it was 5 times in total. Multiple times going to the urgent care, or just my doctor needing to get skin staples or stitches or whatever. And lots of amounts of self-harm that never actually warranted medical attention. But I mean, I end up with scars still all over. Let's see here. Affective instability, affective, not effective, but affective. Instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. So for example, intense episodic dysphoria, irritability or anxiety, usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. So basically, very unstable moods. And I mean, this relates back to whether or not you have the skills to be able to regulate your moods, right? And so if someone doesn't know how to use tools for emotional regulation, then you're going to have a lot of that kind of instability. Chronic feelings of emptiness. This is something that I even though I don't meet the criteria for borderline anymore, this is something that I still struggle with. I'd say every waking moment of every day. It doesn't ever really go away. I shouldn't say that. The last time I can say that I didn't feel that way was when my family was together for Christmas. But as soon as those types of, festivities and group activities disappear, then you end up with this same feeling of emptiness and being alone. And it's hard because it's like you would think that then you'd be like, oh, okay, I need to go spend time with people. But yet you feel this sense of like, I don't even want to spend time with people. I don't want people around me. I don't want to talk about this. But it ends up doing more damage than good. Inappropriate, intense anger, or difficulty controlling anger. This is something that I used to really struggle with. It's just like any other emotion where it has to do with your own ability to control it and have regulation of it. I know that ADHD also tends to have this same kind of characteristic of outbursts and not uncontrollable, but I guess to some degree some people experience that uncontrollable rage. It says here, for examples, frequent displays of temper, constant anger, or recurrent physical fights. I've never been a physical fighting type person, but I could definitely see why some people experience that. And then transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. So this is where you see a lot of that borderline, so to speak, between psychosis and neurosis, because there is this characteristic of dissociating. And there's a couple different types of dissociation, which we will touch on at a different time. But essentially it has to do with derealization and depersonalization. At least those are the two that I know of that I can come up with off the top of my head. I'll have to go and do some more reading about it to make sure that I have included everything before I talk about it. But essentially it's kind of like, the best way I can describe it is almost like you're sort of suspended between reality and not dreams. I don't even know how to describe it, but for me, it happens very much in the mornings. I have a really hard time with being able to be focused and present and feeling within my body first thing in the morning. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. It could be because of the fact that I have really vivid dreams and chronic nightmares. I don't know. But it's very, very dependent on the person and how exactly it manifests. But oftentimes that is a result of immense emotional distress and strain. That is a way that your brain copes with it. Some people, withdraw, and others sort of have these outbursts. And sometimes it's like, if you look at, say, like a thermometer and the temperature goes really, really hot, when you go beyond that, it's almost like a reset in a way where it's like, it's so hot that your brain can't even handle it. And so it switches into dissociation. That's my understanding of it based on what I learned in my DBT program, but I will be doing some more looking into that to make sure that I'm not giving you guys false information. So those are the 9 symptoms that you are supposed to meet 5 of in order to be diagnosed as borderline personality disorder. Personally, I would have fit most of these. I'm not going to take the time to go through and parse it out right now, but I know that I fit more than the 5. And I know that I don't meet the criteria anymore. And so I think I would like to take some more time talking about each of these individually and relating it to my own personal experience. And I think that's what I'm going to do in the next handful of videos to kind of talk about this sort of thing. So there you go. Those are your 9 symptoms for BPD. Yeah, I will see you guys next time.